You feel overwhelmed by daily pressures that seem to multiply endlessly, leaving you reactive and anxious instead of calm and centered. Every setback at work shakes your confidence, while external chaos disrupts your inner peace, making you feel like you're barely keeping your head above water. I am Marcus Aurelius, who maintained unshakable tranquility while ruling the most powerful empire in history, bearing the weight of millions of lives during plagues, wars, and constant political turmoil. The Stoic principles I developed through my personal meditations will give you a fortress of calm that no external circumstance can penetrate, using the same philosophy that sustained me through the darkest imperial challenges. Whether you're managing modern workplace stress or ancient imperial crises, the fundamentals of inner mastery remain constant. What worked to maintain peace of mind while governing an empire can work for anyone facing contemporary pressures. Like this video, subscribe for more Stoic wisdom, and comment where you're watching from. I want to see how far the need for unshakable peace has spread. I never sought the throne. When Antoninus Pius adopted me as his heir, I was a young man more interested in philosophy than politics, more drawn to the teachings of Epictetus than the machinations of empire. I remember the day he placed the heavy, purple cloak upon my shoulders for the first time. The weight of it surprised me, not just its physical mass, but something deeper, more profound. In that moment, I understood that this garment represented the lives of millions, the decisions that would ripple across generations, the constant pressure of being responsible for an empire that stretched from Britain to the deserts of Africa. The irony was not lost on me. Here I was, a student of Stoicism, suddenly thrust into the position of ultimate worldly power. Everything my philosophical training had taught me about the insignificance of external goods was now tested by possessing the greatest external good of an imperial authority. The purple cloak became my first teacher in the art of maintaining inner peace while bearing external responsibility. I quickly learnt that the crown weighs heaviest on the mind, not the head. Every morning, before dawn broke over Rome, I would sit in my private chambers, still wearing the simple tunic of a philosopher, and remind myself of a fundamental truth. The purple cloak could be stripped away by assassination, rebellion, or natural death, but my character, my responses, my inner fortress, these belonged to me alone. The senators expected decisiveness, the generals demanded strategy, the people required leadership, yet none of them could see the daily battle I fought within my own mind, the struggle to remain centered when surrounded by chaos, to maintain philosophical detachment while making decisions that affected millions of lives. This was where I first developed what would become my most essential practice, the discipline of morning reflection. Each dawn, before allowing the world to make its demands upon me, I would examine my own thoughts. I would remind myself that the empire I ruled was temporary, that the problems I would face that day were opportunities to practice virtue, and that my true power lay not in commanding legions, but in commanding myself. The purple cloak hanging nearby served as a daily reminder that external circumstances, no matter how grand or terrible, could not disturb my inner peace unless I allowed them to. This became my foundation, understanding that while I could not control the weight of the empire, I could control how I carried it. The cloak would always be heavy, but I could choose to wear it with grace, dignity, and unshakable inner strength. This simple realization transformed everything from burden to opportunity, from overwhelming responsibility to philosophical practice. The palace never slept. Even in the darkest hours before dawn, I could hear the distant footsteps of guards, the whispered conversations of night servants, the rustle of urgent messages arriving from distant provinces. But in my private chambers, in those precious moments, before the empire demanded my attention, I created a sanctuary of silence. It was here, in the stillness of early morning, that I began the practice that would sustain me through 2 decades of rule. I would sit at my simple wooden desk, not the ornate throne of state ceremonies, and take up my writing tablet. At first, I wrote only brief notes to myself, reminders of philosophical principles, observations about human nature, reflections on the events of the previous day. I had no intention of creating anything permanent. These were simply conversations with my own soul. The writing began as a necessity. I discovered that unless I examined my own mind first, before allowing it to be filled with the concerns of empire, I would lose myself in the endless stream of demands, crises, and decisions. The morning pages became my anchor to who I truly was beneath the purple and gold. I would write, "Today I will meet with interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness." Not because I was pessimistic, but because I was realistic. By acknowledging what I would likely face, I could prepare my mind to respond with virtue rather than react with emotion. This was not cynicism, but practical wisdom, the difference between being caught off guard by human nature and being prepared to meet it with philosophical grace. My morning reflections became increasingly personal. I wrote about my struggles with anger when senators opposed sensible policies for political gain. I examined my frustration when provincial governors sent conflicting reports about the same crisis. I questioned my own motives. Was I making this decision from wisdom or pride? Was my irritation justified, or was it merely my ego being challenged? The tablet became my most trusted counselor, never flattering, never deceiving, always reflecting back the truth of my own thoughts and feelings. Through this daily practice of self-examination, I learned to catch disturbing emotions before they could take root. I could observe my own anger rising during a difficult meeting and remember my morning reflection: the universe is change. Our life is what our thoughts make it. What surprised me most was how this private morning ritual strengthened my public effectiveness. By understanding my own mind first, I could better understand the minds of others. By achieving inner clarity, I could see through the confusion and conflicts that surrounded me daily. The senators who seemed so formidable in the afternoon appeared quite manageable to the emperor who had spent his morning preparing his soul for exactly such encounters. These dawn meditations taught me that inner peace is not a passive state, but an active discipline. It requires daily attention, constant cultivation, and the willingness to honestly examine our own thoughts and responses. Peace is not the absence of disturbance, but the presence of unshakable inner strength that remains. Calm within any storm, the reports arrived with devastating regularity. Scrolls bearing the imperial seal would be placed on my desk each morning, detailing the advance of what historians would later call the Antonine Plague. 5,000 dead in Alexandria this week. Entire legions decimated not by enemy swords, but by invisible death. Trade routes abandoned, cities quarantined. The empire that had seemed so solid, so permanent, suddenly revealed its fragility. I remember the morning when the physician Galen himself entered my chambers. His usually composed face etched with worry. He unrolled a map showing the plagues spread across our territories like ink spreading through water. "Caesar," he said, using the formal address that suddenly felt hollow, "we are facing something beyond our medical knowledge. The death toll may reach into the millions." In that moment, every philosophical principle I had studied, every morning meditation I had practiced, every reflection on the nature of external circumstances faced its ultimate test. Here was suffering on a scale that defied comprehension, and I, the most powerful man in the world, could not stop it with all my legions, all my wealth, all my authority. This was when I truly understood what Epictetus meant when he taught about the dichotomy of control. I could not control the plague's spread, but I could control my response to it. I could not save every life, but I could ensure that the empire's response embodied virtue rather than panic. I could not eliminate the suffering, but I could choose how to bear witness to it with dignity and purpose. I made a decision that morning that would define my reign. I would not retreat to some distant villa to wait out the crisis in safety. Instead, I would remain in Rome, governing from the center of the storm. More than that, I would personally oversee the relief efforts, ensuring that imperial resources reached those who needed them most, regardless of their social station. Day after day, I read those terrible reports without allowing them to break me. Each scroll represented thousands of individual tragedies, fathers who would never return home, children left orphaned, entire communities wiped from existence. Yet I learned to hold space for both grief and action, to feel the weight of suffering, without being crushed by it. My morning reflections during this period became more intense, more essential. I would write, "Death smiles at us all, and all a man can do is smile back." Not because death was pleasant, but because accepting its inevitability freed me to focus on what remained within my power. How to serve those still living with courage and compassion. The plague taught me that true strength is not the absence of feeling, but the ability to feel deeply while still acting wisely. I grieved for the dead while organizing relief for the living. I acknowledged the empire's vulnerability while working tirelessly to maintain its stability. I faced the limits of my power while exercising what power I had with maximum effectiveness. Through those dark months, I discovered that inner peace does not require external perfection. In fact, it is often forged in the crucible of circumstances beyond our control. The emperor who emerged from the plague was not unchanged. I was marked by what I had witnessed, but I was unbroken. The storm had tested my inner fortress and found its sound. During my campaigns along the Danube frontier, I spent countless hours studying the fortifications that protected our empire's borders. These weren't mere walls of stone and timber. They were carefully designed systems of defense, with multiple layers of protection, strategic positioning, and well-trained guards who knew exactly how to respond to any threat. One evening, as I walked the ramparts of a frontier fort and watched our sentries maintain their vigilant watch, a profound realization struck me. The external fortifications that protected our territories were impressive, but they paled in comparison to the fortifications I needed to build within my own mind. Every day, my thoughts faced invasion from anxiety, anger, frustration, and despair. Unlike barbarian attacks that came seasonally, these internal assaults were constant. This insight led me to develop what I came to think of as the inner citadella fortress of the mind that could withstand any external circumstance. Just as our military engineers designed walls with specific purposes, I began to understand that mental defenses required the same careful planning and construction. The first wall I built was the wall of perspective. When troubling news arrived, rebellions in distant provinces, economic pressures, political opposition, I trained myself to immediately step back and view these events from a broader vantage point. I would ask, will this matter in 10 years? In 100? In the grand scheme of the universe? This practice didn't minimize real problems, but it prevented them from appearing larger than they actually were. The second defensive layer was the wall of acceptance. I learned to distinguish between what was happening and my resistance to what was happening. The event itself might be neutral, a senator's opposition, a military setback, even personal illness, but my resistance to the event was what created suffering. By accepting reality as it presented itself, I could focus my energy on responding effectively rather than wasting it on wishing things were different. The third fortification was the wall of impermanence. Every morning, I would remind myself that everything I could see from my palace windows, the buildings, the people, even the empire itself, was temporary. This wasn't morbid thinking, but liberating wisdom. If everything was transient, then present difficulties were also transient. If my greatest achievements would eventually pass away, then my current failures were not permanent either. The innermost keep of my mental fortress was built on a simple foundation, the understanding that my character was the only true possession that could never be taken from me. Barbarians might threaten our borders, senators might plot against my policies, disease might ravage the population, but no external force could make me respond with anything less than virtue unless I chose to do so. I practiced these defenses daily, like soldiers drilling with their weapons. When a messenger brought news of another frontier attack, I would immediately engage my mental fortifications, perspective to see it as one challenge among many, acceptance to deal with reality rather than my preferred version of reality, impermanence, to remember that this too would pass, and character to respond with wisdom rather than emotion. The most remarkable discovery was that these mental fortifications didn't make me passive or detached. Instead, they made me more effective. When my mind was protected from disturbance, I could think more clearly, plan more strategically, and lead more decisively. The inner fortress didn't separate me from the world. It made me more capable of engaging with the world from a position of strength rather than reactive weakness. I learned the art of emotional transformation not from any teacher, but from necessity. Ruling an empire means facing a constant stream of situations designed to provoke anger, frustration, fear, and disappointment. Early in my reign, I would feel these emotions rise within me like floodwaters, threatening to sweep away my rational mind and leave me reacting rather than responding. The breakthrough came during a particularly challenging session with the Senate. A group of senators was opposing a crucial military appropriation, not because they disagreed with the policy, but because they wanted to demonstrate their power. I felt anger building inside me, hot, righteous anger at their petty politics, while soldiers on the frontier needed supplies. In that moment, instead of expressing the anger or suppressing it, I became curious about it. What if I thought this anger could be transformed into something useful? What if every negative emotion contained within it the seeds of virtue? This question changed everything. I began to experiment with what I called emotional alchemy, the practice of transforming base emotions into golden wisdom. When anger arose, instead of acting on it or fighting against it, I would examine it carefully. What was this anger trying to tell me? Usually, it was pointing to something that violated my sense of justice or effectiveness. Rather than letting anger control my response, I could use its energy to fuel more determined but measured action. Fear became my teacher about preparation. When anxiety about potential problems arose, instead of being paralyzed by worry, I would transform that fearful energy into strategic planning. If I was concerned about barbarian movements along the frontier, that concern could fuel better intelligence, gathering, and military preparation. Fear, properly channeled, became foresight. Frustration with difficult people and ruling means. Dealing constantly with difficult people became an opportunity to practice patience and understanding. When provincial governors sent contradictory reports, when generals questioned my strategies, when senators pursued personal agenda over imperial needs, my initial frustration could be alchemized into deeper insight about human nature and more. Skillful leadership approaches, even grief and sadness, which came frequently during the plague years, could be transformed. The deep sorrow I felt witnessing so much suffering became compassion that motivated more effective relief efforts. Personal losses and every emperor experiences, many became reminders of life's preciousness that made me more present and grateful for what remained. The key to this emotional alchemy was speed and awareness. The faster I could catch an emotion as it arose, the more choice I had about how to work with it. If I waited until anger had already flooded my system, transformation became much more difficult. But if I could notice the first spark of irritation, the initial flutter of anxiety, the beginning whisper of sadness. I could redirect that emotional energy before it hardened into reactive patterns. I developed specific practices for this transformation. When I felt anger rising, I would immediately ask, how can this energy serve justice? When fear appeared, I would ask, what preparation does this fear recommend? When sadness arose, I would ask, how can this grief deepen my compassion? This wasn't about eliminating emotions. They contain important information and energy. It was about becoming their master rather than their slave. Instead of being moved around by my feelings like a ship without anchor, I learned to harness emotional energy for virtue, the way a skilled sailor harnesses wind for speed and direction. The practice required constant attention, like tending a sacred fire, but over time it became as natural as breathing. Emotional storms still came, but they no longer devastated my inner landscape. Instead, they became weather that passed through my mental sky, often leaving behind clearer conditions and renewed energy for whatever needed to be done. The greatest paradox of leadership, I discovered, is that the more completely you master yourself, the less you need to control others. This realization transformed not only how I ruled the empire, but how I understood the very nature of authority and influence. In my early years as emperor, I made the mistake that many leaders make. I believed that effective governance meant directing every detail, micromanaging every decision, and ensuring that my will was imposed at every level. I would grow frustrated when senators didn't immediately embrace my policies, when generals questioned my strategies, or when provincial governors interpreted my directives differently than I intended. Then I began to notice something remarkable. The occasions when I was most centered and peaceful within myself were precisely the times when others naturally aligned with my leadership. When I entered the Senate in a state of inner calm, confident in my principles, but unattached to having my way, senators found themselves more receptive to collaboration. When I met with military commanders from a place of quiet strength rather than anxious control, they offered their best strategic thinking instead of merely trying to tell me what they thought I wanted to hear. The transformation began with my daily morning practice. Before engaging with anyone else, I would ensure that my own mind was clear, my emotions were balanced, and my intentions were aligned with virtue rather than ego. I would remind myself that I could not control others' responses, only my own actions. I could not force wisdom upon anyone, only embody it myself, and allow others to choose whether to learn from the example. This inner discipline manifested in practical ways. During state business, when a senator would vehemently oppose a policy I believed was necessary, instead of reacting with anger or political maneuvering, I would remain curious about their perspective. What legitimate concerns might be hidden beneath their opposition? What fears or interests were they protecting? By staying centered myself, I could listen more deeply and often discover solutions that addressed both imperial needs and senatorial concerns. Asterisk. My relationship with military commanders underwent a similar transformation. Rather than demanding unquestioning obedience, I learned to share my strategic thinking, explain my reasoning, and invite their expertise. When I approached military planning from inner confidence rather than defensive insecurity, generals offered honest assessments instead of flattering reports. We achieved far better outcomes through genuine collaboration than I had ever accomplished. Through imperial decree, the ripple effects were extraordinary. As I became more skilled at governing my own responses, my closest advisors began exhibiting the same qualities. Calmness bred calmness. Rational discourse encouraged rational discourse. When the emperor demonstrated emotional mastery, it became the standard throughout the court. Even more striking was how this affected the broader empire. Provincial governors, taking their cue from how imperial business was conducted, began handling local disputes with greater wisdom and less heavy-handed authority. The tone I set in Rome traveled throughout the territories, creating a more thoughtful and effective administrative culture. I learned that true authority doesn't come from the power to punish or reward, but from the consistent demonstration of virtue under pressure. When people see someone who remains steady in crisis, wise in complexity, and fair in conflict, they naturally want to follow that example. They trust such a leader because they trust the principles that guide them. This doesn't mean that firm decisions weren't sometimes necessary, or that clear directives weren't required, but those actions, when taken from a foundation of self-mastery, carried a different quality. They came from wisdom rather than reactivity, from service rather than ego, from strength rather than fear. The ultimate lesson was this: the empire I governed most effectively was the empire within myself. Every external challenge rebellious, senators threatening barbarians, natural disasters, or political crises, was first and foremost an opportunity to practice virtue. By winning the daily battle for self-mastery, I discovered that most external battles either resolved themselves or became far more manageable. In my private garden stood a sundial, its bronze gnomon casting shadows that marked the passage of time with ancient precision. I would often pause there between meetings, watching how the shadow moved imperceptibly yet constantly, and reflecting on a truth that took me years to fully understand. The present moment is the only time that actually exists, yet it's the time we spend least attention on. My mind, like most minds, had a tendency to live everywhere except where I actually was. During morning audiences, I would find myself rehearsing responses to problems that might arise later. While reviewing military reports, my thoughts would drift to past campaigns and their lessons. At dinner, I would worry about tomorrow's Senate session or regret something I had said that morning. Meanwhile, the one moment that was real, the current moment, would pass unnoticed. This mental wandering wasn't merely inefficient, it was the source of most of my disturbance. When my mind lived in the past, it brought regret, resentment, and the impossible wish to change what had already happened. When it lived in the future, it brought anxiety, fear, and the futile attempt to control what had not yet occurred. Only in the present moment could I find peace, because only in the present moment did I have any real power. I began practicing what I called the discipline of attention. When meeting with senators, instead of thinking about how to handle the next senator while the current one spoke, I would focus completely on understanding what this person was actually saying right now. When walking through Rome's streets, instead of planning my route or dwelling on palace concerns, I would notice the faces of citizens, the sounds of commerce, the quality of light on ancient stones. This practice revealed something extraordinary. The present moment, fully experienced, contained everything I needed. When I was completely present with a difficult decision, the right course of action often became clear without the mental struggle I usually employed. When I was fully attentive to a person speaking, I could hear not just their words, but their underlying concerns, fears, and hopes. When I was entirely focused on current circumstances, I could respond with precision rather than reacting from past patterns or future anxieties. The sundial taught me another crucial lesson: time is always moving, but there is always only this moment. The shadow that marked the third hour was not the same shadow that marked the fourth hour, yet there was only ever one shadow at a time. Similarly, my life consisted of a continuous stream of present moments, each one unique, each one the only real opportunity for thought, feeling, or action. I learnt to use physical sensations as anchors to the present. The feeling of my feet on marble floors, the weight of my toga on my shoulders, the sensation of breath moving in and out of my body. These became gateways back to the now whenever my mind began its familiar journey into past regrets or future worries. Even during the most complex state business, I could return my attention to the present simply by noticing what I was physically experiencing in that moment. This wasn't escapism or avoidance of responsibility. Quite the opposite, made me more effective in every area of governance. Decisions made from present moment clarity were superior to decisions made from anxious speculation. Conversations conducted with full attention were more productive than conversations held while mentally multitasking. Problems addressed with complete focus were solved more elegantly than problems approached with scattered attention. The practice also revealed that many of the things I worried about either never happened or, when they did happen, were quite manageable when met with present moment awareness rather than anticipated dread. The suffering I experienced from imagining future problems was often worse than the actual experience of dealing with real problems as they arose. Most importantly, I discovered that peace was not something to be achieved in the future when conditions were perfect, but something that could be found right now, in this moment, regardless of external circumstances. The present moment was my refuge, my source of power, and my pathway to wisdom, not some distant destination, but the ground I was always standing on. The marble bust of my adoptive father, Antoninus Pius, occupied a place of honor in my private study. Each morning, as I began my reflections, I would look into those carved eyes and remember that this man who had seemed so permanent, so essential to the empire's stability, was now only memory and stone. This daily confrontation with mortality became one of my most powerful teachers. Most people live as if they will never die, or at least as if death is so distant that it need not influence today's decisions. I learnt to live as if I might die today, not from morbid fascination with death, but because this awareness brought extraordinary clarity to what actually mattered. When you truly understand that your time is limited and uncertain, many problems reveal themselves to be insignificant, while others demand immediate virtuous action. My first real lesson in death's wisdom came during a particularly brutal frontier campaign. A young centurion, barely 25 years old, was struck down by an enemy spear while carrying out orders I had given. As I watched his life ebb away in the field hospital, I felt the familiar human rage against the unfairness of it all: his youth, his promise, the family that would mourn him. But in that moment of grief, something shifted in my understanding. Death, I realized, was not a punishment or a failure or an enemy to be defeated. It was simply the natural conclusion to every story, including my own. The tragedy was not that this young soldier had died, but that his life, however brief, had been lived with courage and honor. Death gave meaning to life by making it precious, finite, and therefore significant. Every moment became valuable precisely because there were not infinite moments. I began practicing what the Greeks call meditatio mortis, meditation on death. Each evening, I would reflect not only on the day's events, but on the reality that this day would never come again, that I was one day closer to my own death, and that the decisions I had made that day were now permanent parts of whatever legacy I would leave. This wasn't depressing, it was energizing. It made me want to use my remaining time more wisely. The practice transformed my relationship with daily frustrations. When senators engaged in petty political maneuvering, I would remember that in 100 years, none of us would be here to continue these arguments. What mattered was whether I responded to their pettiness with virtue or vice, because that response was adding to the sum total of good or evil in the world. When provincial governors sent reports inflated with their own importance, I could see through the vanity to the underlying insecurity that drives all humans who have not yet accepted their mortality. Death also became my counselor in matters of courage, knowing that I would certainly die someday, whether in battle, from disease, or simply from age, freed me from the paralyzing fear of death that makes cowards of so many leaders. If death was inevitable, then the only question was whether I would meet it having lived virtuously. This knowledge allowed me to make necessary but risky decisions, without being paralyzed by fears for my personal safety. Perhaps most importantly, contemplating death taught me to love life more fully, not less. Knowing that my time with my wife Faustina was limited made every evening together more precious. Understanding that my reign was temporary motivated me to leave the empire in better condition than I had found it. Recognizing that my thoughts and words were finite made me choose them more carefully. I learned to see death not as life's opposite, but as life's completion. Just as a piece of music is not ruined by ending indeed, the ending gives meaning to all the notes that came before her. Human life is not diminished by death, but given shape and significance by its temporal boundaries. The fear of death that haunts most people is really a fear of having lived poorly, of reaching the end, without having become who they were capable of becoming. This daily conversation with mortality became a source of profound peace. When you have truly accepted that your life is temporary, external circumstances lose much of their power to disturb you. Threats become less threatening when you're not desperately clinging to life. Losses become more bearable when you understand that all possessions are temporary. Conflicts become more manageable when you remember that everyone involved is mortal and therefore deserving of compassion rather than hatred. In my private chambers, I kept a golden ceremonial cup that had been given to me by a delegation from Egypt. It was exquisitely crafted, adorned with precious stones, worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. I kept it empty, not because I couldn't afford to fill it with the finest wine, but because its emptiness reminded me daily of a fundamental truth. Wanting less brings more peace than having more. The cup became my teacher in the discipline of desire, perhaps the most difficult and most essential practice for anyone seeking unshakable inner peace. Desire, I learned, is like fire. Properly controlled, it provides warmth and light. Uncontrolled, it consumes everything in its path, including the one who feeds it. When I became emperor, the entire wealth of the known world was at my disposal. I could command any luxury, acquire any possession, fulfill any material desire. Yet I quickly discovered that each satisfied desire gave birth to new desires, and each new desire promised happiness while delivering only temporary pleasure, followed by renewed wanting. The more I had, the more I seemed to need. The more my desires were fulfilled, the more creative my mind became at generating new desires. This insight led me to study the nature of desire itself. I began to distinguish between natural needs and artificial wants. My body needed food, but it didn't need exotic delicacies from distant provinces. I needed shelter, but I didn't need a palace larger than some cities. I needed companionship, but I didn't need constant flattery and entertainment. I started practicing voluntary limitation. When servants brought elaborate meals, I would eat. Simply, when advisors suggested expanding my already magnificent quarters, I would decline. When opportunities arose to acquire new treasures or luxuries, I would ask myself, will this addition to my possessions add to my peace or subtract from it? The answer was almost always that more possessions meant more responsibilities, more concerns, more opportunities for loss and disappointment. This wasn't asceticism for its own sake, but strategic wisdom. I was training my desires to align with reality rather than demanding that reality align with my desires. I was teaching myself to find satisfaction in what I already had, rather than constantly seeking satisfaction in what I didn't yet have. The practice extended far beyond material possessions. I applied the same discipline to my desire for approval, for success, for others' behavior to match my preferences. When senators disagreed with my policies, my initial desire was for them to see the wisdom of my position and immediately change their minds. When I disciplined this desire, accepting that they might never agree, regardless of how logical my arguments, I could focus on presenting my case clearly without being disturbed by their response. I learned to desire what was already happening, rather than always wanting something different. When winter came, I practiced desiring winter rather than wishing for spring. When difficult problems arose, I practiced wanting to face difficult problems rather than wishing for easy ones. This wasn't passive resignation, but active acceptance that freed enormous amounts of mental energy for dealing effectively with whatever circumstances actually existed. The empty cup reminded me daily that contentment comes not from filling all desires, but from examining which desires were worth having. Some desires for justice, for wisdom, for virtue were worthy of pursuit because they aligned with human flourishing. Others for endless luxury, for others constant approval, for circumstances to always be easy, were sources of perpetual frustration because they were either unattainable or, if attained, unsatisfying. I discovered that the happiest moments of my reign were not when my desires were fulfilled, but when my desires were aligned with reality. When I wanted exactly what I had, when I preferred exactly what was happening, when I desired precisely the challenges I was facing in those moments, I experienced a peace that no external acquisition could provide. This discipline didn't eliminate desire but transformed it. Instead of being pushed around by endless wanting, I became the conscious director of my own aspirations. I could choose which desires to cultivate and which to release. I could want things while not being disturbed if I didn't get them. I could enjoy possessions without being possessed by them. The empty cup taught me that the space itself has valued that. The absence of wanting can be more fulfilling than the presence of having. That the discipline of desire is not about having less, but about needing less, which paradoxically creates the freedom to enjoy more. The ambassadorial seal from the Germanic tribe still sits in my collection, a crude bronze disc that accompanied one of the most challenging negotiations of my reign. The barbarian king who sent it was arrogant, dishonest, and seemed to take pleasure in making unreasonable demands. Yet that seal taught me one of my most valuable lessons about human nature. Every person, no matter how difficult, is acting from their own perspective and believes they are being reasonable. Ruling an empire means dealing constantly with difficult people, senators who value personal gain over public good, generals who confuse boldness with wisdom, provincial governors who interpret every imperial directive to their own advantage, foreign leaders who mistake diplomacy for weakness, citizens who blame the emperor for everything from bad weather to their personal misfortunes. Early in my reign, I took these challenges personally. When someone opposed my policies, I assumed they were questioning my competence. When subordinates failed to follow instructions precisely, I interpreted it as disrespect. When foreign leaders made outrageous demands, I saw it as an insult to Roman dignity. This personal interpretation of others' behavior was a constant source of disturbance and anger. The transformation began when I started studying these difficult people with the same curiosity I brought to philosophical problems. What were they really trying to achieve? What fears or desires were driving their behavior? What would I do if I were in their position with their knowledge, their pressures, their limitations? The barbarian king, who seemed so unreasonable, for instance, was actually in a desperate position. His people were being pushed westward by other tribes, facing starvation, and saw raiding Roman territory as their only option for survival. His arrogant demands weren't really about disrespecting Rome, they were about projecting strength to his own people, while secretly hoping for some face-saving compromise. Once I understood this, I could craft a solution that met his real needs, while protecting Roman interests. I developed what I called the practice of charitable interpretation. Instead of assuming the worst about others' motives, I would assume the best that was plausibly consistent with their actions. The senator who opposed my tax policy might genuinely believe it would harm his constituents, rather than simply being obstructionist. The general who questioned my strategy might have legitimate tactical concerns. Rather than just challenging my authority, this didn't mean being naive, or failing to recognize when people were actually acting from malice or selfishness. But I learnt that starting with charitable interpretation led to better outcomes even when people's motives were questionable. When I approached someone as if they were reasonable and well-intentioned, they often rose to meet that expectation. When I treated them as if they were my enemy, they often became exactly that. I also learnt to separate people from their behavior. A senator might support a policy I considered harmful, but that didn't make him a harmful person. A general might display poor judgment, but that didn't make him a bad general in all circumstances. A provincial governor might be ineffective in his current role, but might excel in a different position. This separation allowed me to address problematic behavior without writing off the person entirely. Perhaps most importantly, I learned to see difficult people as my teachers. The arrogant senator taught me patience. The incompetent administrator taught me the importance of clear communication. The hostile foreign leader taught me creative problem solving. The complaining citizen taught me empathy for those facing hardships I couldn't see from the palace. Every difficult interaction became an opportunity to practice virtue. When someone was rude, I could practice courtesy. When someone was dishonest, I could practice integrity. When someone was unreasonable, I could practice reason. When someone was hostile, I could practice goodwill. This transformed these challenging relationships from sources of frustration into opportunities for growth. I discovered that my own behavior often influenced others more than I realized. When I approached a difficult person with curiosity rather than defensiveness, they often became less difficult. When I listened to understand rather than to refute, they often became more reasonable. When I looked for ways to serve their legitimate interests along with imperial needs, they often became collaborative rather than oppositional. The most profound realization was that other people's behavior belonged to them, but my response belonged to me. I could not control whether someone would be grateful or ungrateful, reasonable or unreasonable, honest or dishonest, but I could always control whether I would respond with virtue or vice, wisdom or reactivity, understanding or judgment. This understanding liberated me from the exhausting attempt to manage others' behavior and allowed me to focus on the only behavior I could actually control, my own. Each night, after the last petitioner had been heard and the final scroll had been reviewed, I would retire to my private chambers with two simple tools, an oil lamp and my writing tablet. This evening ritual became as essential to my inner peace as the morning meditations, for it was in these quiet hours that I examined not just what had happened during the day, but how I had responded to what had happened. The practice began simply. I would light the lamp, take up my stylus, and ask myself 3 questions. What did I do well today? What could I have done better? What did I learn? These weren't exercises in self-congratulation or self-flagellation, but honest examinations, designed to extract wisdom from experience and prepare my mind for peaceful sleep. I would recall specific moments from the day with precise detail. During the morning Senate session, when Senator Maximus challenged my judicial reforms, how had I responded? Had I listened with genuine openness to his concerns, or had I been defensive? When the messenger brought news of another barbarian incursion, had I maintained my composure, or had anxiety colored my strategic thinking? When my wife Faustina expressed frustration about palace protocols, had I been present and supportive, or had I been distracted by imperial concerns? This evening examination taught me that events themselves were neutral. It was my responses that created either harmony or disturbance in my inner life. The same challenging day could leave me either depleted and agitated or strengthened and peaceful, depending entirely on how I had chosen to meet each situation. The evening review helped me understand these patterns so I could make better choices going forward. I was careful not to use this practice for harsh self. When I discovered that I had responded poorly to some situation, perhaps with anger, when patience was called for, or with anxiety when acceptance would have been wiser, would note it with the same objectivity I would use to observe someone else's behavior. The goal was learning, not self-punishment. Some of my most valuable insights came from examining the gap between my intentions and my actions. I might have intended to listen carefully to a provincial governor's report, but found myself mentally drafting responses before he had finished speaking. I might have planned to remain patient during a difficult negotiation, but noticed irritation creeping into my voice. These gaps showed me where my spiritual practices needed strengthening. The evening review also revealed positive patterns I might otherwise have missed. I began to notice that on days when I had maintained my morning meditation practice, I was more centered throughout the day. When I had taken time to walk in the garden and reflect between meetings, I was more creative in problem solving. When I had approached difficult people with genuine curiosity about their perspectives, conversations had gone more smoothly. I developed specific questions for different aspects of my life. For leadership, did I make decisions from wisdom or from ego? Did I serve the empire's needs or my own preferences? For relationships, was I present with the people who spoke to me today? Did I listen to understand or to formulate responses? For personal virtue, when faced with choices between the easy path and the right path, which did I choose? The practice taught me to celebrate small victories as well as learn from mistakes. Perhaps I had remained calm during a crisis, or had found a creative solution to a complex problem, or had shown genuine compassion to someone in distress. Acknowledging these moments reinforced the behaviors I wanted to continue, and reminded me that virtue was not some distant goal but a series of daily choices. Most importantly, the evening review prepared my mind for restorative sleep. By examining the day's events and extracting their lessons, I could set them aside rather than carrying them into the night. Problems that had seemed overwhelming during the day often appeared more manageable when viewed through the lens of evening reflection. Mistakes that had felt catastrophic revealed themselves to be opportunities for growth. This nightly practice of conscious conclusion created a natural rhythm: morning meditation to prepare for the day, evening review to learn from the day, and then peaceful sleep to restore energy for tomorrow's challenges. The oil lamp that illuminated these reflections became a symbol of the inner light that examination of conscience brings to the soul, not the harsh glare of judgment, but the gentle illumination of wisdom. In my military campaigns along the Danube, I carried a battle standard that had survived countless storms, battles, and seasons. The fabric was weathered, the colors faded, but it remained intact because it had learned to bend with the wind rather than resist it. That banner taught me a profound lesson about the nature of emotional resilience. For years, I had approached my inner life like a fortress builder, trying to construct walls so strong that no emotion could breach them. I thought strength meant never feeling disturbed, never experiencing doubt, never allowing external circumstances to affect my inner state. But this approach was like trying to build a wall against the weather, futile and exhausting. The breakthrough came during a particularly difficult period when multiple crises struck simultaneously: a plague outbreak in the eastern provinces, barbarian raids increasing in frequency, and political opposition to my military spending created a perfect storm of pressure. Despite all my philosophical training and meditation practices, I found myself experiencing waves of anxiety, frustration, and doubt. Instead of fighting these emotions or judging myself for having them, I became curious about their nature. I noticed that emotions, like weather, followed certain patterns. They arose, intensified, reached a peak, and then naturally subsided if I didn't interfere with the process. The anxiety about the plague would surge when I received casualty reports, but it would settle into manageable concern if I didn't feed it with catastrophic thinking. I began to understand that inner peace was not the absence of emotional weather, but the ability to remain centered within it. Just as a skilled captain doesn't try to eliminate storms, but learns to navigate through them, I needed to develop the ability to experience strong emotions without being overwhelmed by them. This insight led me to practice what I called weather watching of the soul. When anger arose during a difficult Senate session, instead of either expressing it inappropriately or suppressing it forcefully, I would observe it with detached interest. How did anger feel in my body? What thoughts did it generate? How long did it last if I neither fed it nor fought it? I discovered that emotions had their own intelligence. Anger often contained important information about injustice that needed addressing. Fear frequently pointed to real dangers that required preparation. Sadness helped me process losses and develop compassion. Even anxiety, properly understood, was my mind's way of trying to prepare for potential challenges. The key was learning to be with emotions without being possessed by them. I could feel angry about corruption without becoming a rage-filled person. I could experience fear about barbarian threats without becoming paralyzed by anxiety. I could feel sadness about the plague's victims without sinking into despair that prevented effective action. This required developing what I called dual awareness, the ability to experience an emotion while simultaneously observing myself, experiencing it. Part of me might be feeling frustrated with the provincial governor's incompetence, while another part remained aware that I was feeling frustrated and could choose how to respond to both the situation and the emotion. I learned specific techniques for working with difficult emotions. When overwhelmed by multiple pressures, I would acknowledge each concern individually rather than trying to solve everything at once. When anger threatened to cloud my judgment, I would pause and ask what just action this anger was pointing toward. When anxiety about the future arose, I would redirect my attention to what I could actually do in the present moment. The weathered battle standard taught me that true strength isn't rigidity, but flexibility. The oak tree that refuses to bend breaks in the storm, while the reed that bends with the wind survives. Similarly, the leader who tries to be emotionally invulnerable becomes brittle and breaks under pressure, while the one who can feel deeply while remaining centered develops true resilience. I also learnt that emotions, like weather, serve important functions in the larger ecosystem of the soul. Just as rain nourishes growth and storms clear the air, difficult emotions often preceded periods of greater clarity and strength. The challenges that had initially seemed like obstacles to my peace became the very experiences that deepened my capacity for wisdom and compassion. Most importantly, I discovered that accepting the weather of the soul didn't make me passive or weak. In fact, it made me more effective. When I stopped wasting energy fighting my emotions, I had more resources available for addressing the situations that had triggered them. When I could remain calm within the storm, I could see solutions that were invisible when I was focused on eliminating the storm itself. One morning, I entered my throne room to find it temporarily empty. The servants were cleaning the marble floors and had removed all the furnishings. Seeing that vacant space where the symbols of imperial power usually resided struck me with unexpected force. For a moment, I could vividly imagine the room permanently empty, the empire fallen, my reign ended. Rather than disturbing me, this vision brought profound clarity. This experience introduced me to what became one of my most powerful practices: deliberately imagining loss before it occurred. The Stoics call this premedita malorum, the premeditation of evils. But I discovered it was less about dwelling on misfortune and more about appreciating what I currently possessed while building resilience for inevitable changes. I began setting aside time each week to systematically imagine various losses. What if the next barbarian campaign resulted in my death? What if political rivals succeeded in undermining my authority? What if disease struck my family? What if the empire itself crumbled during my reign? These weren't morbid fantasies, but practical exercises in emotional preparation and perspective. The practice taught me that most of my suffering came not from actual loss, but from the shock and resistance when loss occurred unexpectedly. By mentally rehearsing potential losses, I could experience some of that shock in advance, when I still had the resources to process it thoughtfully rather than reactively. When real difficulties arose, they felt more manageable because I had already considered how I might respond to similar challenges. Negative visualization also revealed how much I took for granted. When I imagined losing my health, I became more grateful for my current physical strength. When I pictured the empire without me, I appreciated more deeply the opportunity to serve in this role. When I considered my wife, Faustina's mortality, our evening conversations became more precious. The practice didn't make me pessimistic about the future, made me more present and grateful in the current moment. I learned to apply this technique to daily frustrations as well as major potential losses. Before important Senate sessions, I would imagine the worst possible outcomes: complete rejection of my proposals, hostile questioning of my judgment, even attempts to limit my authority. By mentally preparing for these possibilities, I could enter the actual session with equanimity. If things went poorly, I was prepared. If they went well, I was pleasantly surprised rather than taking success for granted. The practice also built genuine courage. Once I had thoroughly imagined losing everything I valued and had mentally walked through how I would respond with virtue in such circumstances, external threats lost much of their power to intimidate me. If I could face the prospect of total loss with composure, then partial setbacks became much more manageable. I developed specific visualization exercises for different areas of concern. For military campaigns, I would imagine defeats, casualties, and strategic failures, then consider how to respond with honor and wisdom even in the worst scenarios. For political challenges, I would envision corruption scandals, provincial rebellions, or Senate opposition, then plan virtuous responses to each possibility. For personal losses, I would contemplate the deaths of loved ones, my own mortality, or the end of my reign, then reflect on how to find meaning and purpose even in grief. The key was always to imagine not just the loss itself, but my response to the loss. Would I meet defeat with grace or bitterness? Would I face political opposition with wisdom or anger? Would I encounter personal tragedy with courage or despair? By rehearsing virtuous responses to imagined difficulties, I was training my character for real challenges. This practice paradoxically increased both my resilience and my enjoyment of life. Knowing that everything was temporary and could be lost made present experiences more vivid and meaningful. Conversations with friends became more engaging when I remembered they were finite. Policy achievements felt more satisfying when I acknowledged they could be reversed. Even simple pleasures like walking in the garden carried greater weight when I considered that such walks would not continue forever. Negative visualization taught me that the anticipation of loss is often worse than the actual experience of loss. When I imagined losing imperial power, the prospect seemed devastating. But when I considered how I had been perfectly content before becoming emperor, I realized that returning to private life might actually be quite peaceful. The loss itself wasn't the problem. My attachment to not losing was the source of suffering. Most importantly, this practice prepared me for the ultimate loss that awaits every human being, death itself. By regularly contemplating my own mortality and imagining how I would want to face my final moments, I could live each day with greater purpose and less fear. If I was prepared to lose everything, including life itself, then I was truly free to focus on what remained within my control, how to respond to whatever circumstances arose with wisdom, courage, and compassion. In my study stood a bronze scale that I used for weighing important decisions. On one side, I would place all the external circumstances: wealth, power, health, reputation, others' opinions. On the other side, I would place virtue, justice, courage, wisdom, temperance. Over years of weighing these against each other, I made a discovery that transformed everything. Virtue always outweighed everything else, and virtue was the only thing that could never be taken from me. This realization didn't come easily. Like most people, I initially believed that a good life required a combination of virtue and favorable external circumstances. Surely, I thought, it was better to be virtuous and healthy than virtuous and sick, better to be just and wealthy than just and poor, better to be wise and respected than wise and despised. The scales seemed to suggest that external goods, while perhaps less important than virtue, still added real value to life. The transformation began during a period when everything external seemed to be going wrong. The plague was devastating, the empire, barbarian pressures were increasing, political opposition was mounting, and I was experiencing personal health problems that left me constantly fatigued and often in pain. By conventional measures, these were serious evils that should have made me miserable. Yet I noticed something remarkable. My peace of mind remained intact as long as I responded to these challenges with virtue. When I faced the plague with courage and compassion, organizing relief efforts and maintaining hope for the future, I felt strong despite the external devastation. When I met political opposition with wisdom and patience, seeking to understand rather than simply to win, I felt centered regardless of the outcome. When I addressed my own illness with acceptance and continued dedication to duty, I felt purposeful even while experiencing physical discomfort. The inverse was also true. On occasions when external circumstances were favorable, but I responded with vice, when I let success make me arrogant, when I allowed easy times to make me complacent, when I used my power for personal gratification rather than public service, I felt disturbed and hollow despite having everything most people desired. This led me to a profound understanding. External circumstances were truly indifferent. Health was generally preferable to sickness, wealth to poverty, success to failure. But none of these externals could make me genuinely happy or unhappy. Only my responses to these circumstances, virtuous or vicious, determined my actual well-being. I began testing this insight systematically. When I received good news from a frontier campaign, I would examine my response. Was I grateful or proud? Did success make me more humble or more arrogant? Was I using this victory to serve the empire better or to enhance my own reputation? The external event was the same, but different responses led to entirely different inner experiences. When bad news arrived, natural disaster, an economic setback, a political defeat, applied the same analysis. Was I responding with wisdom or anxiety? Was I using the setback as an opportunity to practice resilience or as an excuse for self-pity? Was I focusing on what I could control or wasting energy lamenting what I couldn't change? The pattern became clear. Virtue was the only true good because it was the only thing that consistently led to flourishing regardless of external circumstances. A virtuous person could be happy in poverty or wealth, sickness or health, success or failure. A vicious person would be disturbed and hollow, regardless of how favorable their circumstances appeared to others. This understanding liberated me from the exhausting pursuit of externals. I no longer needed perfect health to be content. I could be content while managing illness virtuously. I no longer needed universal approval to feel secure. I could feel secure knowing I was acting with integrity regardless of others' opinions. I no longer needed guaranteed success to feel purposefully. Could feel purposeful by giving my best effort regardless of outcomes beyond my control. The bronze scale taught me to evaluate every situation by asking, how can I respond to this with virtue, rather than how can I make this situation turn out the way I want. When senators opposed my policies, the question wasn't how to force their agreement, but how to present my case with wisdom and accept their decision with grace. When barbarians threatened our borders, the issue wasn't how to guarantee victory, but how to prepare thoroughly and fight courageously, regardless of the outcome. This shift in focus from controlling externals to controlling my responses eliminated most sources of frustration and anxiety from my life. I could still work energetically to improve external circumstances. That was part of my duty as emperor. But my peace of mind no longer depended on succeeding in those efforts. Most profoundly, I realized that virtue was not just the highest good, but the only thing that was truly mine. Enemies could threaten my life, but not my courage. Disease could attack my body, but not my wisdom. Political rivals could challenge my authority, but not my integrity. Natural disasters could destroy my possessions, but not my compassion. Everything external was on loan from fortune and could be recalled at any time, but virtue was my permanent possession, growing stronger with each decision to choose it over vice. This understanding transformed death from a fearsome enemy into a neutral event. If virtue was the only true good, and if virtue belonged to my character rather than my body, then death could take away nothing that actually mattered. I could die poor or rich, defeated or victorious, respected or despised, but as long as I died virtuously, I died well. In my private study, I kept a celestial globe that showed the movements of stars and planets across the heavens. During difficult days, I would spin this bronze sphere and contemplate the vast universe. It represented distances so immense that the entire Roman Empire, for all its grandeur, occupied less space than a grain of sand on a beach. This practice of expanding my perspective beyond immediate concerns became one of my most powerful tools for maintaining inner peace. When senators engaged in petty political maneuvering, I would remember that their arguments, which seemed so important in the marble halls of Rome, were taking place on a small planet orbiting an ordinary star among countless billions of stars. When provincial governors sent urgent reports about local disputes, I would consider that these conflicts, while requiring attention, were minute events in the cosmic story that had been unfolding for eons and would continue long after every participant was forgotten. This wasn't an exercise in diminishing human importance or avoiding responsibility. Rather, it was a way of seeing present challenges in their proper proportion. The cosmic perspective didn't make problems disappear, but it prevented them from appearing larger than they actually were. It was like stepping back from a painting to see the whole composition. Instead of being overwhelmed by one brushstroke, I developed different scales of perspective for different situations. When dealing with immediate personal frustrations, delayed message, an uncomfortable meeting, a minor protocol dispute, I would expand my view to encompass the entire day. Was this irritation worth disturbing the peace of these precious hours? When facing larger challenges like military campaigns or policy debates, I would extend my perspective to span years or decades. How would this decision matter in the long arc of imperial history? For the most overwhelming crises, I would invoke the ultimate perspective, the view from the cosmos itself. The plague that devastated our provinces was a terrible tragedy affecting millions of lives, but in the context of the universe's vastness and the countless worlds that likely existed among the stars, even this catastrophe was a local event in space and time. This didn't diminish my compassion for the suffering or reduce my efforts to provide relief, but it prevented despair from paralyzing my judgment. The practice taught me that most of what we consider earth-shaking events are actually quite small. When viewed from sufficient distance, the political crisis that kept me awake one night would be forgotten within a year. The military defeat that seemed catastrophic would be balanced by future victories. The personal insult that triggered my anger would be irrelevant by next month. Even my entire reign, however successful or unsuccessful, would eventually become a few paragraphs in history books. This cosmic view also revealed the interconnectedness of all things. Just as every star was part of vast cosmic patterns invisible from any single vantage point, every human action was part of larger social and historical patterns that extended far beyond individual awareness. My decision to show mercy to a captured barbarian leader might influence tribal relations for generations. A senator's vote on a seemingly minor law might set precedents that shaped legal thinking for centuries. I learned to see myself as both infinitely small and profoundly significant small in the context of cosmic space and time, but significant as a conscious participant in the universe's ongoing creation. Each choice I made was adding to the sum total of virtue or vice in existence. Each moment of wisdom or compassion was contributing to the universe's capacity for good. Each act of justice was helping to align human society with the rational order that governed the stars. The celestial globe taught me that the same forces that moved planets in their orbits were operating in human affairs, just as heavenly bodies followed natural laws in their dance across the sky. Human events followed patterns of cause and effect that extended far beyond immediate appearances. Understanding this cosmic order brought acceptance of outcomes I couldn't control and wisdom about where to direct my efforts most effectively during particularly challenging periods. I would go outside at night and look up at the actual stars rather than just the bronze representation. Seeing that vast sweep of light across the darkness reminded me that my problems, however pressing, were temporary disturbances in a fundamentally orderly and beautiful universe. The same stars that shone my troubles had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, the birth and death of millions of individuals, the endless cycle of challenge and resolution that defined conscious existence. This practice didn't make me fatalistic or passive. If anything, it energized me by connecting my daily work to something larger than personal success or failure. Knowing that I was playing a small but real role in the cosmic story made even routine administrative tasks feel meaningful. Whether I was reviewing grain shipments or settling legal disputes, I was participating in the universe's ongoing experiment with rational, compassionate governance. The cosmic perspective ultimately taught me that inner peace comes from understanding our place in the larger whole, neither so important that every setback is catastrophic, nor so insignificant that our choices don't matter. We are brief expressions of the universe's capacity for consciousness, awareness, and virtue, and that role is both humbling and profoundly dignifying. If I were to walk among you today, I would find much that amazes me about your modern world: your ability to communicate instantly across vast distances, your medical knowledge that far surpasses anything we possessed, your technologies that would seem like magic to ancient eyes. Yet I would also find something remarkably familiar. Humans still struggle with the same fundamental challenges to inner peace that plagued my subjects 18 centuries ago. Your modern device that brings you constant messages resembles the endless stream of urgent scrolls that once flooded my palace, where I received reports from provincial governors and military commanders. You receive notifications from colleagues, news outlets, and social platforms. The medium has changed, but the challenge remains the same: how to maintain mental clarity and emotional balance when external demands compete constantly for your attention. The morning meditation practice I developed for imperial duties translates directly to your contemporary needs. Before checking your first message or beginning your workday, spend time examining your own mind. What thoughts arose as you awakened? What emotions are you carrying from yesterday's unfinished business? What intentions will guide your responses to whatever challenges today brings? This brief period of self-examination creates the same centered foundation that sustained me through decades of imperial pressure. Your workplace politics mirror the Senate dynamics I navigated daily. The colleague who takes credit for your ideas resembles the senator who appropriated provincial accomplishments. The supervisor who seems to make arbitrary decisions echoes the provincial governor who ignored imperial guidelines. The solution remains the same. Focus on what you can control, your own responses rather, than exhausting yourself trying to control others' behavior. When someone treats you unfairly, practice the same charitable interpretation I learned to apply to difficult barbarian kings and hostile senators. What pressures might they be facing? What fears or insecurities might be driving their behavior? This doesn't mean accepting mistreatment, but approaching conflict with curiosity rather than outrage opens possibilities for resolution that anger closes off. The discipline of desire I practiced with my empty golden cup applies directly to your consumer culture. Each advertisement promising happiness through acquisition, each upgrade claiming to solve life's problems, each external goal presented as essential for fulfillment. These are modern versions of the same delusions that troubled ancient minds. Train yourself to distinguish between genuine needs and manufactured wants. Practice contentment with what you have while working toward legitimate goals without attachment to specific outcomes. Your evening should include the same reflective practice I maintained with my oil lamp and writing tablet. Before sleep, examine the day's events. Where did you respond with virtue versus reacting from emotion? What situations triggered old patterns of thinking or behavior? What did you learn about yourself and others? This conscious completion of each day prevents unresolved tensions from accumulating and prepares your mind for restorative rest. The practice of negative visualization adapts perfectly to contemporary anxieties. Instead of worrying vaguely about potential job loss, imagine specifically how you would respond with dignity and resourcefulness if it occurred. Rather than being paralyzed by fears about health problems, mental rehearse how you would meet such challenges with courage and grace. This builds genuine resilience while reducing the anxiety that comes from avoiding difficult thoughts. Your relationship with social media and news requires the same wisdom I applied to court gossip and provincial reports. Much of what appears urgent is actually insignificant. Most of what seems personally threatening is actually beyond your direct influence. Focus your attention on information that helps you serve others more effectively, and limit exposure to content that feeds outrage or anxiety without enabling constructive action. The cosmic perspective I gained from studying celestial movements you can achieve by contemplating the vast scales of space and time that modern science reveals. When workplace conflicts feel overwhelming, remember that you're having these experiences on a planet orbiting one star among hundreds of billions in a galaxy. That's one of trillions in the observable universe. This doesn't diminish the importance of treating others with justice and compassion, but it prevents temporary setbacks from feeling like ultimate catastrophes. Apply the weather metaphor to your emotional life. When anger, sadness, or anxiety arise, remember that emotions are like things natural, temporary, and often containing important information. Don't try to eliminate them or be overwhelmed by them. Learn to experience feelings fully while maintaining your capacity for wise action. Create your own version of my morning and evening rituals. Whether you write in a journal, practice meditation, or simply sit quietly with your thoughts, establish consistent times for self-examination and reflection. These practices become more valuable during difficult periods, so maintain them, especially when they seem unnecessary. Most importantly, remember that the same capacity for virtue that guided me through imperial challenges exists within you. Every situation that tests your patience is an opportunity to develop greater patience. Every person who frustrates you is a teacher in disguise. Every setback that disappoints you is practice for resilience. The external circumstances may be different, but the internal work of building character and maintaining inner peace remains exactly the same. As I write these final reflections, I am acutely aware that these words may outlive the empire I have served, the monuments I have built, and the laws I have enacted. The bronze will corrode, the marble will crumble, and the political structures will evolve beyond recognition. But the principles I have shared with you, these have the power to endure as long as human beings seek peace amidst the storms of existence. The manuscript of my personal meditations sits before me, filled with the private thoughts I never intended for others to read. Yet perhaps these intimate conversations with my own soul will prove more valuable than any public pronouncement I have made. They represent not the wisdom of an emperor speaking to subjects, but the discoveries of one human being learning to live with purpose and tranquility in an often chaotic world. The practices I have described, morning reflection, emotional alchemy, the discipline of desire, evening review, negative visualization, and cosmic perspective, are not merely intellectual exercises but daily tools for building an unshakable inner fortress. Like physical exercises that strengthen the body through consistent repetition, these spiritual exercises strengthen the soul through patient application. The senator who practices these disciplines will find greater peace than the emperor who neglects them. I have learned that inner peace is not a destination to be reached, but a practice to be maintained. There is no graduation from the need for daily attention to your thoughts, responses, and character. The moment you assume you have mastered these principles is the moment you begin to lose them. Humility and continuous learning are essential companions to wisdom. The compound effect of these practices reveals itself slowly but powerfully. Days of morning meditation accumulate into months of greater clarity. Weeks of evening reflection build into years of deeper self-knowledge. Repeated choices of virtue over convenience create a character that naturally responds to challenges with grace rather than reactivity. Small daily disciplines create large transformations over time. What amazes me most is how inner peace ripples outward to affect others. When you maintain your own center during conflicts, others around you begin to calm down. When you respond to hostility with goodwill, you often diffuse situations that could have escalated into lasting enmity. When you approach problems with philosophical acceptance rather than emotional resistance, you become a source of stability that others can lean on during their own struggles. This is how individual transformation becomes social transformation. The person who has learned to govern their own responses with wisdom becomes naturally equipped to help others govern theirs. The leader who has mastered inner peace creates environments where others can find their own peace. The parent, teacher, friend, or colleague who embodies these principles becomes a living example of what human beings are capable of achieving. Remember that you are practicing not just for yourself, but for everyone whose life you touch. Every moment of patience you maintain, instead of expressing irritation, makes the world slightly more peaceful. Every instance of responding to injury with goodwill rather than revenge adds to the universe's store of healing. Every choice of virtue over vice contributes to the slow but persistent triumph of human dignity over human destructiveness. The ultimate test of these principles is not whether they make your life free from difficulties, but whether they enable you to meet difficulties with nobility. The goal is not to eliminate all sources of disturbance, but to become the kind of person who cannot be fundamentally disturbed by external circumstances. This is the freedom that no tyrant can take away, no disaster can destroy, and no setback can diminish. As my own life draws toward its close, I find profound satisfaction not in the victories I have won or the territories I have governed, but in the character I have built through daily practice of these principles. Whatever legacy I leave in marble and bronze will eventually fade. But the example of one human being learning to live with wisdom, courage, justice, and temperances example can inspire others across the centuries. Your life, like mine, is a brief opportunity to practice virtue in the face of uncertainty. The circumstances you encounter will be different from mine, but the inner work remains the same. The choices that truly matter: how to respond to injustice, how to face loss, how to treat others, how to maintain hope during dark times. These choices are available to every human being, regardless of their external situation. Take up this practice with patience and persistence. Build your inner fortress one day at a time. Transform your responses one situation at a time. Let every challenge become an opportunity to grow stronger in wisdom and compassion. This is the path to unshakable peace, and it is open to anyone willing to walk it with dedication. The empire I ruled was vast but temporary. The peace I found within myself, this is the only conquering that truly matters, the only victory that can never be taken away. May you discover this same unshakable tranquility within yourself, and may it ripple outward to bless all those whose lives you touch. This is my final gift to you, the knowledge that such peace is possible and the practices that can make it yours.